The House of Commons Standing Committee on Official Languages in accordance with Standing Order 1083 and the motion adopted by the committee on Monday, January 29, 2024. The committee is resuming its study of language obligations related to the process of staffing or making appointments to key positions. Now, we are, of course, all in the habit of doing these hybrid meetings, so I will just skip through the reminders for everyone who's on Zoom. We have our witnesses here in the room. I'd like to welcome our witnesses. We start with Ms. Geneviève Tellier, professor here at the University of Ottawa, appearing as an individual. And from the Public Service Alliance of Canada, we have Mr. Alexander Silas, Regional Executive Vice President for the National Capital Region, as well as Mr. Pierre-Samuel Proux, who is a Senior Research Officer. As you know, well, maybe you don't know, this will be news to you, Mr. Silas has been here before, right? Yeah. So you're going to have 5 minutes each for your opening remarks, and then we will go into the question and answer period. There will be questions by each of the political parties. Ms. Tellier, I will be strict with the timing so that we get through 2 rounds of questioning. I am giving the floor over to you for the next 5 minutes. I will keep this short. I'd like to thank the committee for inviting me to testify as part of its study on linguistic obligations in the staffing process or in making appointments to key positions. I'm a professor at the University of Ottawa, and I am as part of the public administration program. I am therefore very familiar with staffing issues in the public service as well as with the challenges of implementing public policy. As you know, no doubt, the University of Ottawa is a bilingual institution, and in fact, it's the largest bilingual French-English university in the world. So I'm quite familiar with the issues involved in the 2 languages existing together in the workplace. I'm also very familiar with the challenges associated with defending a language with a precarious status, such as French in Ontario, as well as the obstacles to be overcome when teaching a second language. And I regularly comment on current news through columns published in Le Droit, Franco-Presse, and Radio-Canada. Through these columns and my contributions, I regularly deal with language issues. One of these columns received a lot of attention when it was published. It was published on July 9, 2021 in the Le Droit, and it had to do with the appointment of the Governor General. I wrote then, and I still maintain this position today, that the Governor General's lack of knowledge of the French language was extremely damaging, not for the Francophonie in Canada in general, but specifically for the Francophonie outside Quebec. Francophones outside Quebec have been fighting for years to demonstrate that knowledge of French in bilingual organizations is not just an asset, but an essential skill. This nomination destroyed years of effort and struggle. This proof is in my own organization. There is rather proof in my own organization where bilingualism in senior management positions is no longer considered an essential skill or in the creation of English-only university programs. This appointment also implicitly insinuated that it was not possible to associate the French-speaking world with diversity, and yet recent appointments to high public office prove just the opposite. Just think of Justice Michel Aubin-Serwan or the Lieutenant Governor of Quebec, Ms. Manon Janot. While promoting and protecting bilingualism requires strong leadership at the highest level of public administration, it also requires commitment from all employees. They must be sensitive to the issue of languages and bilingualism. This sensitivity needs to be present as early as possible in the career path of employees, especially those aspiring to higher positions in the hierarchy. In an ideal world, bilingualism should be required at the time of hiring for all positions, and if that is not possible, then second language teaching should be introduced as soon as possible. The longer we wait, the more difficult it becomes. I can illustrate this case by talking about our Masters of Public Administration program offered at the University of Ottawa. This program is unique in Canada because one of its objectives is to train future bilingual public servants. We have adopted an asymmetrical approach to achieve this. English-speaking students are required to take a course in French. The reverse, however, is not required. French-speaking students can register for courses in English, but they are not obliged to do so. This requirement is a challenge for most English-speaking students, but the results are there for all to see. In fact, many of these students choose to enroll in other courses offered in French at a later date. This case shows that we have to overcome initial obstacles and be persistent in our policies. This concludes my presentation, and I'd be delighted to answer any questions you might have. Thank you very much, Ms. Tellier. And for the Public Service Alliance of Canada, I don't know which one of the two is going to be presenting, but Mr. Silas, you have the floor for 5 minutes. Good morning, Chair and members of the committee. I'd like to thank you for your invitation for us to appear at this committee. My name is Alex Silas, and I am the Regional Executive Vice President. I live in the Vanier neighborhood. I have Mr. Pierre-Samuel Proux with my colleague who is with me, a Senior Research Officer. The Alliance of the Public Service of Alliance of Canada is one of the biggest unions, and we represent thousands of employees. Our members work in federal agencies, universities, casinos, community service centers, and airports. We are trying to defend the rights of workers, including the work to write in the language of choice, of their official language of choice. When it comes to recruiting, language training, we are also very much involved. And despite the progress that's been made, there are still challenges. We are seeing that government doesn't really seem very enthusiastic about improving bilingualism in the federal public service to offer better services to Canadians and making sure that every employee is comfortable working in their language of choice.
Is encouraged and supported by the employer, and we believe it's the federal government's duty to provide the necessary tools to make this happen. A public service where bilingualism is encouraged means, for example, a team where communication flows smoothly and without misunderstandings, a more inclusive, diversified workplace, and the elimination of language barriers and language insecurity. If managers and people in key positions don't speak official languages, both official languages, it's more than likely that the employees under them will work in only one of the languages, not both. I think it's also important to point out that bilingualism in the federal public service is crucial for ensuring that Canadians can interact with their government in the official languages of their choice. This helps strengthen citizens' confidence in government institutions and promotes linguistic inclusion at all levels of society. PSAC is proposing several measures to improve bilingualism in the federal public service, in addition to new provisions for Indigenous employees who express themselves orally or in writing in an Indigenous language in the course of their duties. L'amélioration de la prime du bilinguisme est un des exemples.
Improving the bilingualism premium is also a good example, but it has not been improved in many years. It's been at the same level since it was introduced. We're talking about more than 25 years. Despite our repeated requests, the government refuses to increase this bonus. And in a report in 2019, they even suggested removing this bonus, which we find completely unacceptable. If the government really wants to support official languages, we believe that the bonus needs to be increased in order to really value the work being done and offer more language formation of high quality to encourage both English and French speakers to improve their second language. We are also suggesting support for Indigenous languages for those who use these languages in the public service, and that will also be meaningful for reconciliation. The Treasury Board and our labor union got together to work with hundreds of employees, federal employees who use Indigenous languages, and their contribution to the public service should be highlighted. The federal government, as an employer, should set the example and officially recognize the contribution of its staff who are using Indigenous languages in the fulfillment of their services to serve the communities that they are serving. And if the government really wants to reinforce both official languages, then they should make language training more accessible in a more proactive manner. We need more language training, both for English and French speakers, to improve their second language, which will make them even more capable to deliver services. We also need language training to overcome barriers and to allow employees and equity-seeking groups to have access to management positions. At the moment, Indigenous members are underrepresented in these leadership positions, and they do not really have full access to language training. We also ask that the Treasury Board stop contracting out language training and concentrate on creating its own training program including public service employees. And the same for translation services, that should also not be contracted out. I'd like to thank you for your time, and I'd also like to thank interpreters for their work. I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Silas. All of our witnesses use their time wisely. It looks like they want to answer many questions. Okay, so here's how this is going to work. We're going to go to each of the political party in the first round for 6 minutes. It will be an interactive question and answer session, and we start with the first vice chair of this committee from the Conservatives, Mr. Godin. You have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for being here this morning. It is quite cold outside next to the Ottawa River. I'm going to start with Ms. Tellier. I was about to say Ms. Le Tellier, but that's a thing of the past. It was music to my ears when you spoke about the Governor General. And you said in your opening remarks that it was extremely damaging what happened. And you said that they should lead by example. How do you consider the influence of the highest office in Canada? And this is nothing against the individual, of course. We're not blaming the individual, but this person is sitting at the highest office in Canada, and it is a representative post, represents a bilingual country, and bilingual English and French. As I often say, this person is bilingual, but she does not speak French. So how can we repair this damage? Well, there could be, of course, 2 ways of going about this. The soft approach and the hard approach. The soft approach would be to take into account what has happened and to say this will not happen again. But I've been looking at the recent nominations of lieutenant governors in the different provinces. We don't see this in Quebec, but the federal government seems to have taken this into account. At least for Ontario, there is a Franco-Ontarian who was nominated to this position. So one might hope that this will not happen again. And we should continue to, of course, underline the importance of this issue. So that's the soft approach. Now, the tough approach would be to change the legislation and make things more clear at the tribunals. There's room for more clarification, but we can make it explicit and to say that at the Supreme Court of Canada or Governor Generals or Lieutenant Governors, they have to speak English and French. We don't want to take things there, but if there's inaction, that might be the only way of solving this. Thank you, Ms. Tellier. When the Governor General was nominated, of course, it caused a whole debate, and it was not really acceptable. But you mentioned that in the only bilingual province, there was a unilingual Governor General. So the actions did not follow the words. There's no willingness, there's no action. And we're seeing this. Now, the Official Languages Act that we currently have, is it doing its job? Does it provide the necessary tools? And we don't know what department, because there's a lot of confusion when it comes to who has what responsibility. There's the Treasury Board, there's Canadian Heritage, there's Justice, there's the Privy Council. So there are a lot of loopholes that would allow politicians to pass the buck or the responsibility to someone else. How do we deal with this? That's a great question. The Act has just been amended, and the Commissioner of Official Languages has been saying that we still need time to see new results. But when you have new legislation, the faster you act to introduce the intention of the legislation, the better the results you have. So if you wait for things to go back to normal, then there won't be too many changes. So it takes a lot of strong leadership and quick intervention and in the introduction of measures to change things. That's how you get results. So you have to see, again, the work of this committee is also very, very important, and the committee should be very clear on the types of the changes that you'd like to see. You maybe should contact the Commissioner of Official Languages on this, but you shouldn't wait, and you should hold the government to account. So leadership should come from the highest instances. In my opening remarks, I was also referring to the higher levels of the public sector. So the highest level was what I was referring to. So the implementation should be quick through the regulations. Let's talk about that efficiency and quickness, there's an act that we have, and there are tools available to the commissioner. There are fines. That's not the wording used in the act, but that is roughly what that tool is. And you said we need to act quickly. So complaints should be filed, but they're not filed. And you also talked about being quick in reacting to the situation. And the President of the Treasury Board told us here at the committee that it might take up to 3 years to introduce the regulations. So as you were saying, does that not show a lack of willingness on the part of this government? I feel compelled to agree with you. It appears that there's no urgency on the matter. Despite many years of complaints, the situation is not really getting better. So pressure should be put on the government from all circles, including Francophone communities or official language minority communities, because that is the minority. The minority aspect of these communities is really important. So it's concerning at the moment. And the act, of course, the adoption of the act also took quite a long time. Ms. Tellier, what would be some of the methods that could be used to change the situation? We made the observation, but what would you recommend to us as lawmakers to take action and to protect French? That's a great question, but we will have to wait for the next round to get the answer. Minus 5 seconds. Well, I told you I was going to be strict with the timing, but do not forget your answer to this question. Second question will come from the Liberal Party. And Mr. Iacono, you have the floor for 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank the witnesses for being here this morning. Very cold morning. This might be the coldest day in a while. Ms. Tellier, language skills, so the operational knowledge of the 2 official languages of Canada, should it be an obligation in hiring to the high levels of the public service in Canada? Yes, and not just for them. Our approach should be, our default approach should be that bilingualism should be requested from everyone. And then we should proceed by elimination and then go, okay, in such and such circumstances, it might not be necessary. But bilingualism should always be top of mind. And when the federal government is a bilingual institution, if it's a bilingual institution, then that is an important factor when it comes to organizing our business in this institution. So yes, for the higher echelons, and bilingualism before being nominated to positions, because there are cases where individuals learn French after the fact, but as they're learning French, that means some people are not being served in French. And people who are in some of these positions, if they're not bilingual, what measures should be taken to make sure that these people become bilingual? Well, it's quite complicated. You have to be sensitive when it comes to the circumstances leading to the nomination of these people. So after the fact, if you say we've changed the rules, you will end up losing your employment. I don't think that's the right way to proceed. So we have to take into account the circumstances around these nominations. And we might say this is not going to happen in the future, but we can, of course, try to see if training can be provided, but this should be made a priority. What about the operational needs? If this one person has the capacity, has the skills, and other people don't, in a hiring window, what should be the method? Well, do they have the capacities if they're not bilingual? That is the problem, because bilingualism, yes, it's essential, but it's at the bottom of the list. It should be at the top of the list. And we should stop saying that because they don't speak French or English, they still have the competencies. No, this person does not have the competencies, so we should change the way we approach. And we should say, okay, these are the skills, and this person does not have the skills. And if we still want this person, absolutely, we should make sure that they end up acquiring these competencies, but before they are appointed to a certain position, and there might be exceptions, of course. I'm fully in agreement with you, but during the hiring window, if you don't have anyone who's qualified and the only thing that's holding someone back is the language, what do? Do we wait for someone who has a skill as well to present themselves? Because sometimes you don't have people and you need to hire someone, and then the person might end up learning the other language and they have the other skills and competencies that they can use on the job. Well, I'll challenge you on that, and I'll say, well, show me that it does not exist. We hear that very quickly and very easily. I mean, show me that there's no one else who can do the job. And why is French the skill that should be at the bottom of the list, and why are some other skills at the top of the list? If you have a candidate who's bilingual but they don't have certain skills, well, I mean, maybe you can concentrate on training that person on some of those other lacking skills if they are bilingual. So you're checking all the boxes except French. I mean, look at it as a whole, and French shouldn't be at the bottom of the stack. I will be sharing my time with my colleague. Microphone, please. Well, Francophonie versus the diversity, that's a point you made in your opening remarks. Can you elaborate on that? Well, in the Francophone community, we often hear, again, going back to the question of skills, diversity becomes an important matter. So why do we not have diversity in the Francophone community? Look at what's happening in Quebec or elsewhere. Look at the Francophonie in Toronto. It's extremely diversified, and I see this in my courses as well, in my classrooms as well. I teach in both languages, but French classes or French courses in Ottawa are more diversified than the opposite, than the English. So show me that there is no diversity in the Francophone community. Does this tie in with what's happened with the Governor General? Well, that's the most visible example, but I can give other examples as well, but it's not the only one. Mr. Silas from New Brunswick. Welcome, sir. Very quickly, you were saying less than 15 seconds, Mr. Sanson. So a unilingual Anglophone supervisor supervising a group of Francophones, was that the case you referred to?
Absolutely. If there's just one person who only speaks English, everyone switches to English. That's an excellent question. You managed to slip that one in. And then third question is going to come from the Bloc Québécois, who's the second Vice Chair. Over to you, Mr. Beaulieu. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses today. Each time I hear it's urgent, it's urgent. I've heard that since I first came to the Parliament, but it seems that nothing's really moving ahead. Do you think we're making progress, or are we going backwards? I'm putting the question to you. Both, I would say. We're making progress in the public arena. There is more sensitivity to this question. People are more alive to the linguistic issue in the Canadian population, so there's progress. And knowledge of both languages has also improved. For example, in Ontario, the French immersion education programs are very popular here. So people are more sensitive. However, when we look at the results from Stats Canada, in Quebec, bilingualism is really going up, in particular amongst Francophones, but in the rest of Canada, bilingualism of English speakers is not going up. It's stuck at the same level. What I wanted to see was that we're now tracking that question. We're attentive to that, so that's progress. So as you said, in the public arena. But are we making progress within the federal government machinery? I don't think so. But one of the big issues is that we don't have enough data. So one recommendation that I put to the committee is that you really need to push for data. You need to have evidence. But at the same time, it seems that we've got lots of studies out there. And often, well, Stats Canada for a long time was basically denying that there was a decline in French. Now there's been a bit more opening on this question. So now we're hearing people talking about it more in the public arena, but we'll have to see what happens next. And now turning to the PSAC. So for these appointments and for staffing, where there are language obligations, well, we've had various discussions on that, and we've been told why not require knowledge of French from the outset? Because, as you said, Ms. Tellier, we accept people, it seems, who are not equipped with French skills, and we hope that they're going to learn French, and then we see that it's not really efficient. So why don't we require that from the outset, from the get-go? And as Mr. Iacono said earlier, if we don't find people, what do we do here? It's a question of chicken and egg. If we ask for that requirement, people will get it. But if we don't make this a requirement and say you can have language courses later, I don't think that really works. I agree with Ms. Tilly. It needs to be an acquired skill rather than a secondary skill. But I'd like to say that French and English can be learned. That's why we're asking for more training opportunities, because officials on both sides, English and French-speaking officials, want to develop their bilingual capacity to be able to make progress in their career in the public service. Yes, it's true there needs to be more language training. But I think that from the get-go, we need to ask and require knowledge of French, because otherwise we've seen what's happened with the Governor-General, for example. There are some people where it's not just a question of training. Some people don't really have that linguistic aptitude, and it's very difficult for them. For example, the president of Air Canada, who apparently is taking lessons every day, but it wasn't really working for him. Now, we had the vice president from Quebec, where said there was systemic discrimination that was deeply anchored in the federal machinery and always assumes that everything should take place in English first, and that was the case in Quebec as well. Do you think there's been a change there, or are we going backwards rather than forwards? Well, I think we can see that across Canada, where we have francophone there throughout the country, and often there's this unfairness in terms of promotion opportunities, and there are more high management positions that are posted unilingually in English or bilingually, but French unilingual positions are very rare. And also when it comes to training opportunities, there's more opportunities for English-speaking people wanting to develop their French on the other way around. And in terms of documents, often it's just sent out in English. Sometimes there's drafts that are just sent out in English, and then when the francophones say, look, I can't comment on that, it's just in English, then they're told, look, you'll get the final version in French, don't worry, it'll be translated. But you can't give your feedback, you can't get feedback from the French speakers if the text is just in English. We see that in the government as well, within various commissions, and we get reports coming out just in English. So if that's what's happening in the government, imagine what's happening in the private sector. The government's meant to set the tone and lead by example. Then on language training, we've heard from specialists in this matter. And now you said there should be a centralized model for this. I think there was a training school. Sorry, it's hard for me to hear myself speak, actually. But as I was saying, we were told that there was a centralized language training. There was a training school initially, and then it was decentralized to save costs. And then there can be outsourcing in the departments for language training, so quality has gone down. Do you think we need to come back to the former model, where it's a bit like the Translation Bureau did in the past? Should we come back to one public service language school that would cover all of the departments? Absolutely is the answer. When it comes to outsourcing, there's cost savings in the short term, but studies show that in the long term it costs more. So workers within the federal public service are doing important work. So it's important to invest in the language training services within the public service so that they can have specific training geared to the public service. And now fourth question will come from the NDP. 6 minutes. You have the floor, Ms. Ashton. Thank you very much. And thank you also to our witnesses today. I've got questions for the PSAC. You've said that in negotiations with the Treasury Board, you did for a review of the directive on bilingualism to go from $800 to $3,000. Now, why do you think the Treasury Board has not accepted to actually increase that amount? And why do you think an increase in this directive anchored amount would actually reinforce bilingualism within the public service? Thank you. Well, I think we'd all agree that $800 in 2024 is not the same thing that back in 1977. I think there's a lack of will here to really give value to the contribution that the two languages make to public service and recognise the importance of bilingualism to better represent and serve the Canadian population. So I think there's a lack of will and they're not giving value to both official languages. Okay, so when it comes to well-paid jobs, how can that contribute to reinforcing the capacity to attract and retain the bilingual staff that's needed in the public service? We know there's a great deal of outsourcing in general, not just when it comes to language training, but there's a great deal of outsourcing within the public service that's taking place. Do you think that that's harmful in terms of efforts being made to retain bilingual people and attract bilingual people into the public service? Absolutely, there's a great deal of problems with retention. Here we're talking about investing in the importance of both official languages and recognition of Indigenous languages also in the public service. So yes, it's an investment. It's a significant investment because it would lead to a better quality of service in official languages vis-à-vis the Canadian population.
And the PSAC has been very clear on the importance of recognizing and valuing Indigenous languages in the public service. Advocacy groups say there are barriers to learning French in marginalized communities in parts of, say, Western Canada, where I am in, and particularly in Indigenous communities. How do we fix this? How do we address the systemic gaps in language training so that we can strengthen bilingualism in the civil service, so that we can also value what Indigenous language-speaking public servants or potential public servants could bring to the table? Do you have any recommendations?
Absolutely. Look, there was a joint study between the employer and the union that showed that there are hundreds of workers in the federal public service who use an Indigenous language in writing or orally every day to serve the communities that they're in. This is not something that, this is something they have to do. This is something they need to do to communicate with these communities. And it's not being recognized at all. It's not included in the bilingualism bonus, which needs to be increased. So, yes, I think including that in the bilingualism bonus, and then again, back to increasing opportunities for training. These are trainable skills. These are skills that people want to learn, but there needs to be more opportunities for training, and that training needs to be done in-house in the federal public service, because if it's privatized, it's going to cause more problems. We need to bring that in-house.
Okay. And now, we know that workers in Canada are facing very difficult times, and we know that the PSAC has always been a strong supporter of anti-scab legislation, which, of course, the NDP spearheaded in Parliament earlier this year. I'd like to hear from you. Does the Conservative Party position opposing anti-scab legislation historically, despite the blip we saw on the voting record just recently, worry your union membership? And can you speak to how important anti-scab legislation is to supporting working people, whether in the public service, the federally regulated workplace, and beyond?
Absolutely. We have members on strike right now in non-public funds, CFMWS, who've been on strike for 67 days as of today. They're being replaced by scab labor from DND. Active military personnel are doing their work. Active military are being forced or being ordered to do scab labor. And of course, it's a huge concern to our member. I think the largest gap in the current anti-scab legislation being proposed by the federal government is that it doesn't include workers in the federal government. So definitely that needs to be expanded, and I think we need to go further and pass anti-scab laws provincially as well. The right to unionize, the right to organize, the right to strike should be protected in Canada, and so legislation like this not only needs to be implemented, but needs to be expanded.
Okay, merci beaucoup pour ce message.
Thank you very much for that clear message. Chair, how much time do I have left? 1 minute. Excellent. So finally, I'd like to come back to this question of language learning, language training in English or in French. You've talked about the need to bring these services back inside the public service. Could you reiterate, please, that recommendation once again for us? Absolutely is the response. So when it comes to identifying the specific needs of the public service, the workers within the public service are best placed to understand the situation here. In the short term, it might seem that outsourcing is going to save money, but in reality, in the long term, it costs more to Canadian taxpayers and it costs more for the population in general. So bringing these services in-house within the core public service will lead to better training, to better develop bilingual capacities within the public service, and in the long term, it will be a good investment for the population as a whole. Thank you, Mr. Silas, and thank you, Ms. Ashton. So now we've got a 5-minute question round. First of all, Mr. Bernard Généreux. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses, Ms. Telly. First of all, I'd like to thank you and congratulate you for your excellent career. I follow you and I read your columns, and I've always found that you've got very fair viewpoints, even if you're a bit harsh with the Conservatives in general, but that's fine. Yes, he's reading what you write. Now, you were hard with the Liberals and harsh with the Liberals this morning, and I agree with you when you said that the way in which the Liberals have proceeded with appointments have sent out the wrong signal in the last few years. And we need to remedy this in the future. And Mr. Iacono was talking at the same time as I was talking, the way in which he put his question earlier, I imagine basically shows the Liberal thinking on this. So we've got a 40 million population in Canada. Are we not able to find people who are bilingual and competent, or perhaps even trilingual? I've just recruited someone who speaks 4 languages. That's young people today. They're increasingly open to all of these different languages. And in Canada, we know that there are parents who line up for 24 hours outside to be able to sign up their kids into French immersion school. There's a real movement amongst the population, in particular amongst young people, to learn English and or French, and in particular French, of course. So what do you think about this approach, this liberal approach where they want to appoint people that are unfortunately not bilingual? We are, after all, a bilingual country. De facto, we are the 2 founding peoples of Canada. So it should be something automatic. How do you explain this mismatch? I don't understand that disconnect either. And when I arrived in Ottawa, quite some time ago, I won't say how many years ago, and I arrived in a bilingual institution, the University of Ottawa, and I was struck to see that there wasn't a great deal of bilingualism. And I'll draw a parallel with the University of Ottawa to see how this could then be applied to the public service context. French and research, that's always a problem. We say, yes, we can have research, we can have excellent researchers who speak French, but there's always opposition, and say either you're an excellent researcher or you speak French, but you can't do both. And that's actually a false debate, a false premise. And then to come back to the Canadian population, we've got 40 million inhabitants, so we should be able to find bilingual people. It should be seen as an asset, but I think there's a pedagogical effort to be made earlier in life to learn early on that we are a bilingual country and that you need to have competence in both languages, and also learn this at university. When I was listening to one of the questions earlier, I was thinking to myself that it would be very good if the public service could reach out to universities and say, look, I need bilingual candidates, in particular when it comes to public administration programs. That was an idea that I'd launched in our university, but it wasn't taken up. Why, when it comes to these language tests, if you come from a bilingual university where it's proven that you've taken courses in English and French, surely that could replace the language test. It wouldn't be complicated to set that up, but you need to people who think about these aspects, think outside the box, and see how are we going to save money and make this a more efficient system, send out this type of message that's missing at the moment. We're working in silos. That's what happens. The public service, everybody's in their little corner, and in Quebec it's in French, and the rest of the country it's in English. That's basically the overall vision. And in other bilingual institutions, it's kind of like that things work as well. No doubt you've followed the debate on the adoption of the new Act on C13, Official Languages Act. It hadn't been renewed for the past 50 years. So how do you think this new Act will beef things up, or we hope it will beef up bilingualism in Canada? Within this Act, do you think there are certain mechanisms that will allow us to improve the situation of French in Canada? You have 20 seconds to answer that. Yes. Yes, because there'll be a bilingualism requirement for certain positions, and we've got the Commission of Official Languages. But as I said previously, if we're not actually active to implement this quickly, and if we don't have strong leadership across the board, then we may well find ourselves back in the previous situation once again. Thank you very much, Ms. Tellier. And the next 5 minutes will come from Mr. Drouin. Please go ahead. Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you. Well, Mr. Iacono was talking because, in fact, he was a public servant when you were in government, Mr. Généreux. So he's still kind of suffering some after effects of that. So to come back to the heart of the matter, Ms. Tellier, you teach public administration, and I'd like to come back to the question of executives and all of these performance agreements. Do you know that whether senior executives are actually paid, or rather have they promoted both languages within their own department? Do you know how that works? And do you think that should be part of their performance-related bonus? Well, I don't know, is my brief answer. Bilingualism bonuses seem to be a problem because you're saying, once again, it's an asset rather than an essential skill. If the position requires bilingualism, then it should be better paid. It's your overall salary that should be strengthened. It should be the best people who've got the best skills who are paid well. Now, I carried out a study for the Quebec Treasury Board on the retention of young people in the public service, and it's not the salary that's the main factor. People are there to work for the common good, and if you're there to work for the common good, then bilingualism is part of the common good. You want to serve the population in both languages, and you also want to ensure that there's use of both languages.
So assuming that the salary or the bonuses will take care of everything, well, I think bonuses is a thing of the past, so I would be more inclined to introduce better overall salary levels because there's competition from the private sector, but you also have assets. There are social advantages and benefits, of course, the work being done. So it's a different way of thinking, and people like that. You can rely on that. And do you need to be bilingual to get to these positions? Yes, of course. And people who want to go into the public service, there are many of them. And if they know that to get to good jobs they need to be bilingual, then they will be encouraged in that way. Well, the problem is it takes too much time. But when your competition is KPMG or Deloitte or others, government hiring process takes a long time. And right now we have a shortage of talent. We're not really retaining and improving the talent and the young people within our administration. That's a different topic too. Well, that was the same observation for the Quebec Treasury Board. We reached the same conclusions. They have fascinating positions, but it takes 18 months to hire people into those. Well, beyond regulation and beyond the Act, how do we create a culture in the public service where, yes, we speak both languages? And I can give you a very simple example. There are Anglophone MPs who come here to take French courses, but beyond that, going to a social event and speaking and existing there in French and enjoying this, maybe. Are you aware of people who go, okay, yes, we're all Anglophones, but here today we're going to speak French. It's our Francophone day. That might work, but it's about setting the tone. If you are in charge of a team, then you can do that, and you can, of course, it should go to the higher levels. I'll share an anecdote with you. When I was a student, I was doing my internships, and I was offered something at the Department of Finance here in Ottawa. So I had that, and I had Hydro-Québec. I had two options. And I chose Hydro-Québec because they told me that on Wednesday mornings in Ottawa they speak French, so the rest of the week we're just going to be speaking English. And Hydro-Québec, I was in Rouyn-Noranda, so I didn't go to Quebec City or Montreal, but the language aspect of the thing played an important role. This is just a mere anecdote, of course, but you might have those activities, but if you don't believe in them and you're doing it because it's an obligation, then it's not going to help. You need to be Francophile, not just Francophone. So beyond the act, beyond the regulation, what do we do? Well, being Francophile, and if you have a recruitment procedure where you recognize these people who are sensitive towards French, who are Francophiles, then you will end up enriching your human resources pool. Thank you. For 2 minutes and 2.5 minutes, Mr. Beaulieu, you have the floor. I will talk about the elephant in the room because we keep talking about bilingualism. But when the Official Languages Act was before us, we were talking about this as part of C13. There are collective and territorial language models, Belgium, Switzerland, etc. And then the other model that protects the minority language is the model rather that does this is this model, and Mr. Trudeau chose institutional bilingualism, and we ended up with this decline of the French language at every level, and it's speeding up. And in federal institutions, if we try to make the French the common language in the main territories where you have a majority of Francophones, then that allows people to function in French. But right now we're in situations where Francophones are the minority, and at the end of the day, the English dominates. What do you think about that? The minority status is fragile. We remain a minority, so it will take particular arrangements to deal with that. Well, we should also ask the following question. How do we define bilingualism? What do we mean by that? Does that mean everyone should speak both languages? Does that mean every person can work in their language? If you say every Canadian can work or live in French or English and doesn't have to speak the other while you are in a bilingual country and the two are coexisting. Very quickly, if you look at Belgium in the Flanders region, Dutch is not menaced, even though it's a minority language, and the federal government is bilingual. But here we have bilingualism everywhere, allegedly, but it doesn't function. Francophones outside Quebec, and even Quebec right now. I mean, are we not going to see this in a different light? Because they have a different model, the territoriality model, or a model based on the territories. That's an excellent question, Mr. Beaulieu, but it will have to wait the next round, if there is a next round. Ms. Ashton, you have the floor for 2.5 minutes. We're not hearing you, Ms. Ashton.
Pardon.
Can you hear me now? Okay. My question will be for the Public Service Alliance of Canada. We have heard rumors that the Coast Guard is hiring unilingual Anglophones to work in Quebec. Well, what does that mean for the Coast Guard employees in Quebec and for this essential service? Thank you for the question. We have heard this through our members who work for the Coast Guard in Quebec. Well, the highest level of management is an Anglophone speaker, is an Anglophone, unilingual Anglophone. And sometimes you have people who have French as their mother tongue being forced to work in English without the supports and the formation at work, so they are not feeling very comfortable working in the language of their choice at work. Okay, thank you. That's especially worrying given the nature of the work the Coast Guard does. It's essential, and recently we also heard that within the RCMP system, there are problems with translation and interpretation, which again result from, or rather have the result of not communicating the information in both official languages in due time. Do you think that this lack of bilingualism and people not speaking French, especially in Quebec or in other parts of the country where French is spoken, could that have negative impacts when it comes to relaying essential information that Canadians need? Absolutely. And we hear from our members, they say that there are two official languages in the Federal Public Service. It's English and interpretation. So when it comes to emergency services, it should be communicated in both official languages as soon as possible, not just first in English and then in French after translation after a couple of hours. We have heard examples from our members internally. Communication is usually sent in English first and then French after. And then externally as well, when it comes to important communication, public-facing communication, these are done in English first, and then Francophones end up waiting more. Thank you, Mr. Silas. Thank you, Ms. Ashton. 2 other rounds of 3 minutes. Mr. Godin, you have the floor for the next 3 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to go back to Ms. Tellier on my question from the previous round. We have made the observation, and I think we agree on the analysis. But what do we do now, us as lawmakers, to stop the decline of French? Because English might be declining compared to other languages, but we have a French and English bilingual country, and the only one of these two who is in danger is French. So what would you recommend? Of course, faster implementation is one thing you underlined, but if you have other recommendations, that will be valuable. Thank you. That's a very good question indeed. The challenge here is that you are lawmakers, so you are not directly managing the programs. You are here for accountability purposes, and it's on the accountability front that you can work as lawmakers. So putting pressure on the government, putting pressure on the public servants, and the lawmakers can ask, of course, for certain things. For instance, you can ask for a report on progress made, and you can force the government to explain the steps they're taking. You cannot replace the government, but you can certainly ask questions. That is why your committee is in an interesting position, because we're still talking about appointments, and the Commissioner of Official Languages was telling you, and you can interface with him as well. You can ask questions and follow up on different matters. So you can do this regularly, ask for status updates, and to really hit the nail on the head and keep putting pressure. And sometimes asking hard questions is also a part of your role. Now, you also talked about statistics and data. In the Official Languages Act, well, as part of it, we actually presented a motion that in the next census, this relevant question should be included, but the Liberals were against. In 2021, we fought against the Liberals again that this should be a part of the population census. So we don't have the data, and when you calculate something and when you have right holders, there is a financial impact on our communities, in the official language minority communities. That is a fact. It's an observation. What do you think about that? Well, I might speak to this more in the public service framework. The commissioner said that we don't have the data. We should really dig deep and ask these questions on the ground to people, as the union was saying, well, can you work in French? And getting this information and seeing the trends over time will be valuable. So internally, you should have this sort of data. Thank you, Ms. Tellier. The clock is ticking, and we're going to Mr. Maxere for 3 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank our witnesses for your recommendations to our committee. The study that is before us has been requested by the Commissioner of Official Languages, and it focuses more on public servants and on the different staffing and appointment processes. You have formulated good recommendations, and Ms. Tellier, you referred to senior public servants, and you talked about definitions. How do we define bilingualism at the University of Ottawa, at the Laurentian University, for instance? These are bilingual institutions allegedly, but they are not really bilingual institutions. They offer courses in French, but you drew parallels between different institutions, the University of Ottawa and the senior public service levels. So what can we do? Of course, we have the hiring phase, and we heard from a labor union representative that that for French, the assumption is that they will receive training later on. So I'd like to hear you speak to this point a little bit more. Well, I think I said this, but I'll repeat it. French is an essential skill, and it's not an asset. It shouldn't be at the bottom of the list, as is often the case. And if I am to draw a parallel with the University of Ottawa, when it comes to hiring, we see that unilingual Anglophone professors are hired more often than bilingual professors. It takes leadership, and people have to know that if they want to have access to positions that are interesting, they have to speak 2 languages. So we are talking about the higher echelons. As soon as you enter the public service, this is something you're faced with. And if you say, okay, I'm going to be a DG or a deputy minister at some point, then I need to speak to 2 languages, and that will encourage people to learn and speak to both languages. And it takes a clear policy when it comes to implementing the rules around the 2 official languages, and that should be concentrated around the Treasury Board, and the general parameters should be determined by them, and then each department or the agency will add their own rules. Well, the employment of Francophones to higher levels of the public service is important for us too. There should be more opportunities for unilingual Francophones or those with French as their mother tongue, because the higher levels of senior management, unilingual English speaker, that's okay, bilingual, that's okay, but unilingual French speaker is no good. Thank you very much. We were able to get 2 rounds of questions in. I'd like to thank our witnesses who were with us this morning. Well, I was very strict about timing, but that allowed us to do 2 full rounds of questioning, which is very rare. I interrupted you as the chair on a number of occasions, but if there are elements that you were not able to share with us, please do so in writing. That is key when we are drafting our report. So if you want to add anything that you did not have the time to share with us, please do so. Send it to our clerk. Thank you very, very much. This has been very interesting, this first panel. We are going to suspend briefly and switch over to the second panel. Thank you very much.